Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to program debate. I am your host Tariq Khan. Today we'll analyze and explore the women rights international relations perspectives. It is honor for me to introduce Prof.Dr. Lina Abirafeh. You are the Executive Director, Arab Institute for Women at Lebanese American University, based in New York, Lebanon. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining and welcome in program.
It's my pleasure.
Ma'am, as you know, feminist thoughts or feminism theory is the dominating theory in international relations. So how would you like to give an explanation about the women rights international relations perspectives?
Uh, that is a great question. Well, first of all, let's talk about the global population. We're talking about 7 billion people, of which slightly more than half are women. So the idea that we now belatedly decide that we need to include women in international relations, in international security, in development programming and humanitarian work is a very belated realization. So the reality in the world, and research has shown that there is no chance in the world of any peace or prosperity or progress as long as women are left behind. And the inclusion of women in international relations, in any aspect of public life, in any decision making, in any leadership, is beneficial not only to women, but also to families, to communities, to societies, to countries, and in fact, globally. There's been so many cases, economic cases that have been made, political cases, cases of peace agreements that are more sustainable when women are at the table. Peace lasts longer, it is better, it has a stronger foundation, it is more meaningful for populations. Economies are stronger, institutions are better, schools are more equipped, families are healthier. I mean, the evidence is there for us. So the challenge for us is to really claim it and use it and to understand and absorb from the household level up to the global level this notion of engaging women and feminist perspectives, not as an afterthought, not as a bad word, not as an add-on or a charity, but as something that is a non-negotiable prerequisite that needs to happen everywhere in every space all the time.
Ma'am, you are the most senior analyst and expert and have been advocating women's rights over the globe. So how do you observe the women's rights in real global perspectives?
Well, I tell you, it's actually very upsetting because women's rights are denied, are challenged, are compromised, are questioned everywhere I go. And that includes here in the US, where I now sit, through every region that I've been in. I've spent decades in sub-Saharan Africa, in Middle Eastern countries. I lived in Afghanistan for many years, Papua New Guinea, Haiti, Nepal, all over the place. I see women's rights being questioned and obstructed by every possible institution. So really, it's a challenge of so many levels and layers. And how do we fix it? We've got legislation that works against us, that openly discriminates against women. We've got cultural and religious institutions that hold women back. We've got education and other structures that still have a very gender stereotyped kind of understanding of women's rights and roles. So at every level, from family to society to country, we really need a total overhaul in terms of how we see women's rights. I mean, it's been said many times, women's rights are human rights, and this is no longer up for debate. The fact that we continue to discuss it and defend it, for me, has always been a surprise, because this is something that we are all inherently born with and that should be granted without question, without a fight, and without any sense of debate. So for me, it makes me quite sad to see that violence against women continues, and that is the most egregious manifestation of the lack of women's rights around the world. As long as you as a woman are not safe in your home, in your space, in public, on the street, in the workplace, in schools, in political office, whatever place you might hold, for me, that is a crime that is unforgivable. And all the other rights that we might have are rendered moot as a result. So you can grant women rights in politics, representation in parliament using a quota system, economic opportunities, positive discriminations that might level the playing field. But unless you resolve the issue of violence against women, ending it, ending impunity, guaranteeing that anybody who even makes an attempt, all perpetrators are prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and that the law is on women's side, the side of the survivor or victim, as you might say, then we cannot continue to argue for petty and piecemeal rights. So unfortunately, the global landscape is depressing. And we know that no country in the world has achieved gender equality. So we have a long way to go.
How would you differentiate as well as illuminate the family system along with women's rights in Western as well as Muslim context?
Well, there are opportunities and entry points and challenges and constraints across every context, whether it's Eastern or Western, whether it's Muslim or Christian, whether it is in a household that believes or a non-believing household. In the end, people will always find ways to build an evidence base, or so they think, to obstruct women's rights. Now, historically, all religions have not been particularly friendly to women in the sense that they don't explicitly state that there should be equality. And where they do, those texts are very hard to come by. And women, activists, scholars have to dig hard and deep to be able to find that evidence. And when we do, I mean, it can be found and it's used and it makes for a very strong case. But generally, these are the kinds of things that are very quickly used against us. And more often than not, the institutions that govern our lives globally are patriarchal, meaning that men are in charge and they make decisions that suit them. And that includes religious institutions, state entities, cultural structures and institutions, the media, education, just about everything. So undoing all of that and rewiring our brains to think differently is a massive global project.
How do you view the global women's rights campaigns and the content they are using to display, and how do you enlighten the present day concept of freedom and empowering of women's rights?
Well, I think that women everywhere, all around the world, are going to find ways to fight for their rights within their own cultural constructs and frameworks. So they will do whatever is right for them. To say that women's rights movement, for instance, are Western is actually not true at all, because they are indigenous and they exist everywhere. And any type of so-called feminized labor is not necessarily true. So undoing that again and thinking about our roles, our expectations, our ability to share and to divide the unpaid care. And it is important for men, for fathers, for brothers, for sons to learn how to do their share of the work in the household to keep it running, of the child rearing, of care for the sick. These are skills that all of us need to have. These are essential survival skills. There's nothing inherently female about that. Just like there's nothing inherently male about leadership and politics, right? But these things have been assigned to us since the beginning of time, and we're trying and it benefits all of us to do so. And it benefits the household and children and the next generation when they see that both parents are able to do the cooking and cleaning. Both parents are interested and involved in the lives and well-being of the children, in educating them, in orienting them to be better citizens, in caring for them when they are sick. Everybody needs to do this kind of work. It really builds for a better family structure. It builds for a better society. It builds for stronger countries. I mean, the evidence is there, as we've said. So I think these campaigns are critical. And when they are defined by women inside the country who are directly implicated in that reality, that means it is valid, it is legitimate, it is strong, it is meaningful, it is contextualized. And that's the kind of movement that we want to see. That exists everywhere. And I think it's fantastic. And I think it's even better when men engage with those kinds of movements as well, because there is room for men. I think the majority already share those kinds of thoughts, but maybe don't articulate them or act on them. So how to encourage men also to be more responsible and engaged as fathers, as members of the household. How do we do those kinds of things? It takes a long time, but it takes some men to take on that role and to say, I will do it. I can do it. And I think that's very courageous and it's very important and it's long overdue. So that's what I'd like to see as well. More men stepping in and taking on these positions. We are talking about decades and generations of women who've been held back, who have been denied full participation in society, who've been denied their full roles, who've been relegated to the household, who are rightly angry. You know, a movement doesn't get to this point unless people have tried other means. When you try and you try and you push and you try and expand these boundaries and create space for everybody to live full and rich lives, and that's denied, and women are continuously pushed back, then yes, they take to the streets, and there is a righteous anger. And I understand it completely. And we have seen it in every single movement for civil rights and equal rights, whether it is with women or for different races or different sexual orientations or different anybody who is different, perceived as different and perceived as lesser than. First of all, that is not true. And second of all, have been denied all of their full and equal rights as humans, as citizens of the world for generations, and now are angry. And so sometimes it takes anger, it takes going out into the streets for people to pay attention, because people haven't paid attention before. And these movements are still peaceful. They are not violent, but they are provocative in ways that are making people pay attention. And they are making people have conversations about dynamics in the household and how that can be better divided and what is inherently feminine or not. And I think that is important. And when people see those kinds of things, they can't ignore it. They can't pretend it's not happening. They have to engage with it, whether they believe it or not. And people start to talk about it. They start to question things. And that's how people's views change. It takes a very long time. But for people to be out on the streets, it means they've exhausted some other means. But at the same time, there are people who are continuously using of methods to be able to their reality. There are people who are working on legislative reform and people who are working on reforming the education system and what we teach very young people, both girls and boys, of ways to do this. And being out on the streets and protests, it is not the only way, but it is an important way to get people to pay attention who haven't been paying attention before. Not everybody will use the same methods, but that does not make them wrong. These are different ways to address the same issue. The idea is we have every right that you have, and if people have not been paying attention in the household, on the streets, in our institutions, in our government, then we need to make them pay attention. And as long as those protests are not violent, are not harming anyone physically, I think that everybody has a different way of expressing their need inherently as human beings to have those rights. So it is not for all women to agree on one method. I certainly do not think there is one way to do this. There is not one way to protest. There is not one feminism. There is not one articulation. But the ultimate goal is the same. The idea is that women's lives are just as worthy as men's lives. Women's opportunities should be just the same as men's. I want to see girls and boys treated equally in schools, in all institutions, from birth until the very end of their lives. And those kinds of things, everybody's going to fight for them in different ways. So a conversation about the content of the signs, for me, is not an important conversation to have. What is an important conversation is the different ways that we are all working to build a better society for everyone. That's the kind of conversation I want to have. These are basic survival skills for all humans. And that is why I said, these hands are not made necessarily any different than yours for folding clothes or for cooking a meal. The idea is that we all need to learn those kinds of things. And if we share in those things better, it's not about men helping women, not at all. It is about both of us being seen as equals in the household and sharing things in the ways that we deem appropriate. And that can be negotiated in different ways. It can look different everywhere. It will look different everywhere. And it doesn't negate any kind of cultural frameworks necessarily. It doesn't negate any religious frameworks. It doesn't mean that it is against the country or the religion or the culture or the context or society or men. No, not at all. It's really about expanding our range of choices and our ability to live full and rich lives as humans. All of us want the same thing. We all want to be free. We all want to have good lives and access to opportunities and live in peace and feel safe and prosper and have access to work and land and education and healthcare and understandings that we are valued and we live our lives with dignity and with respect. Everybody wants this. It doesn't matter what your sex is or your gender orientation or the color of your skin or your physical abilities or any of that. And we've seen with social movements around the world, everybody is fighting for the same thing and we all should have it. How we don't have it is, for me, something I never understood, which is why I do this kind of work, because I was never able to understand inequality or injustice.
How do you identify the violence and aggression on women over the globe, and how can we stop this in the light of international as well as Muslim and Islamic law?
Well, I'll tell you this. We know that from statistics, 1 in 3 women and girls worldwide will experience some form of violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3. And that for me is unbelievable. When I talk to people, I say, okay, think of 3 women that you know, women or girls, your mom, your friend, your wife, your sister, whomever, women that you care about in your life. And now pick one of those, and that one is going to experience some form of violence, be it physical or sexual or something. How do we accept that in the world? How do we accept that our bodies are subjected to violence inflicted on us by others through no fault of our own? This, for me, doesn't make any sense. So what can we do? First of all, understand how prevalent it is and how it crosses every culture, every context, every religion, every race, every socioeconomic status. People will always tell you, oh, this doesn't happen here. That's for poor people, or that's for those people, or that's for this culture, or that's for that country. No, it happens to everyone. For instance, now we're all sharing the tragedy of a global pandemic, correct? We're all living under COVID. And what has happened globally is that we were told to lock down, to stay home, and to stay safe so we don't pass on this virus, right? What has happened as a result of that is that women who were in situations where home was not safe were put at further risk, and some women were put in new situations where violence in the home, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sprung up as a result of this lockdown and of these pressures. So in the end, what we saw around the world is an increase in domestic violence as a result of the lockdown measures of this pandemic. So what does that mean? That means that it's actually a universal phenomenon. It's a universal crime. It happens all around the world in every single country. And it happens as a reaction to our insecurities, to crises, to anything where we perceive a loss of our own power. And why is it that we cannot be safe in our own homes? And why is it that some men, not all, feel that they have the right to perpetrate violence against women, inflict violence on their bodies and in their lives, as if it is something that is inherently male, and is their right to do, and is a response to any type of insecurity or any incidents? I mean, this for me is a flawed logic. It cannot continue. So understanding, first of all, the extent of this crime is the first thing we need to do, and starting to stop it in our own lives and in our own homes and in our own societies and in our own cultures and in our own countries. And so that means calling out any types of violence or any violent language or any sexist behavior or anything that makes anybody uncomfortable or discriminates against them that leads to any form of violence, stopping it where it starts, recognizing that the laws are unequal, the laws do not protect women, and they need to be totally reformed, right? In most countries, these laws need a massive overhaul. And so that means making sure that violence against women in all its forms is seen as a crime and is treated as such, and that women who are survivors of these experiences feel safe and are able to report and are not re-victimized as a result of the legal process. This means training the police and security systems to address these issues, to prevent them, to fulfill their duty of care for women and girls, to make sure that they don't say, what were you wearing? Oh, it's your fault. Oh, this happens all the time. No, these are not appropriate responses. They are not acceptable responses. Those responses are a crime in and of themselves. We need to make sure that all the systems and services are set up to respond to these kinds of things, and that systems are set up to prevent them from happening in the first place. That means starting with kids, little kids, teaching nonviolence in schools as part of a response. And you cannot exert violence on anyone. You cannot. And when you teach those kinds of things and teach young people how to respect each other, how to resolve conflict in nonviolent ways, you explore and understand and implement the concept of consent. So my body, it belongs to me just like your body belongs to you. And no one can take it, use it, abuse it, harm it in any way. And anything that happens to you needs to happen with your consent. As an adult, needs to happen with your consent. When it comes to children, they cannot consent because they are children. So anything that happens that is inflicted on children is also a crime, just inherent in the fact that they are not legal adults and they do not understand the concept of consent. So building all of that into the new world and the new way that we think and the new way that we live is difficult and time consuming and costly. But it is so important, because how can we continue to live where more than half of the world's population is living with some form of violence or the fear of some form of violence, which is also a crime? The fear of violence is also a form of violence, as far as I'm concerned. When I walk in the streets and I have to be scared, afraid for my own body, or that a young girl cannot walk on a certain street or cross a cafe where all men are sitting. I mean, these things are ridiculous. We need to reframe all of that, reclaim public space and private space because it belongs to everyone. Everybody has the right to feel safe. And that is not negotiable at all. So what we need to do as individuals, every single one of us, is see it as our own responsibility to build a world that is safe. And a world that is safe for women and girls will mean a world that is safe for everyone.
Ma'am, thank you so much for your valuable and precious thoughts on the topic, and thank you so much again.
Happy to speak to you.